I will be delivering the next two modules, this one on non-motorized transport, which I'm learning is and has been quite a hot topic in the Philippines. Non-motorized transport is key to sustainable urban mobility. And so today we'll cover the fundamentals. We will look at the local context and we'll get very local. I made a video of myself going for a walk around Pasig. We'll look at some of the best practices, and then from the best practices, we'll also do a brief tactical intervention if we have time, where we basically draw on satellite images and street cross sections. So first things first, what is non-motorized transport? Can anyone name a mode of non-motorized transport? Bicycle, yes. Walking. Anything else? Baguio, I learned yesterday, has an interesting mode of non-motorized transport. Horses. I saw that in the video there was a horse icon. And then I inquired, and you have horses. What percentage of the mode share? Very small. Okay, so no justification for segregated horse lanes. Not yet. So yes, walking, cycling, small wheel transport, wheelchair travel, and it's essentially a form of transport that doesn't have an engine or a motor, which is in the name, non-motorized, and it's often referred to as active mobility or human-powered transport. It's a huge topic. It covers many different areas, from walking to cycling to parking to how you integrate utilities in your streets, green infrastructure, etc. We don't have time to cover it all today, but what I hope to get is an understanding of which areas of non-motorized transport and street design you would benefit from support. But today we'll focus mostly on walking. That is really the fundamental of our transport systems, and we'll talk a bit about cycling, but not so much, because that is a huge topic in and of itself. And why do we promote non-motorized transport? Any input from anyone? Health reasons. Perfect. Cost. It's good for the wallet. Lower emissions. Yes. So yes, non-motorized transport is great at the personal level as an individual. There's a lot of health benefits if you cycle. We met Karen yesterday at Pasig. She loves to cycle, and she did it for health reasons and economic reasons, also environmental reasons. You can also avoid congestion, more or less. I see some of the cycle lanes in Pasig are congested with non-bicycle vehicles, which is not ideal, but I am pretty sure that for a lot of short distance trips in Manila and possibly in your home cities, you can get to your destination faster by bicycle, maybe sometimes even on foot, depending on the time of day. So at a personal level, lots of benefits, but of course these benefits extend to the societal level. If you have a high share of walking and cycling, you will have lower public health costs. You will reduce the overall levels of congestion, which is beneficial, and you can also boost transit ridership. So a low share of walking is often not good in the context of creating new public transport systems. But fortunately, you do have very high shares of pedestrians in the Philippines. Unfortunately, these pedestrians don't have the best environment to navigate. And NMT is really the foundation of a transport system. Walking, especially, is the most natural way of getting around. And that's important because everyone is a pedestrian at some point in their journey. Even if you drive a car, you have to walk to the car park to get to the car. So it's in everybody's interest to have good, high-quality, non-motorized transport infrastructure. And how we do that, it's through policies. But in addition to policy, obviously, you need very good street design practices. And there is room for improvement. If we can do this successfully, we can promote safety, inclusivity, and accessibility. And today, again, it's a huge topic. But by the end, I hope you have a better understanding of complete streets, what they are, versus traditional car-based streets, and we'll also look at best practice street design. And if we have time, we can look at different tools to appraise your streets and how we can promote non-motorized transport. And I'd also like to also shape the discussion on how we can better communicate non-motorized transport activities, because sometimes they are not popular. I understand a lot of the recent efforts since COVID are not universally popular, and we all have a role of better communicating why we are promoting NMT. For example, using the 7 Ps of marketing we discussed yesterday. And a lot of the reference material I use is from the Global Street Design Guide. This is if you don't mind me saying, the Bible for non-motorized transport planners and street designers. It is a fantastic reference. It's full of nice schematic diagrams, so I highly, highly recommend this. And then, of course, I've looked at some of the road safety design manuals in the Philippines. About me, I won't go into depth here, but I worked in non-motorized transport for ITDP. Sovan mentioned them yesterday. They do great work on TOD and non-motorized transport, and I worked in East Africa with them. And then since joining the ASEAN GIZ project, we are looking at non-motorized transport activities in our focus regions, and that includes the Philippines, and we really would like to develop additional and new activities in one or all of your cities. In Cambodia, where we are based, there is much work to do. The Philippines is decades ahead of Cambodia when it comes to walking and cycling, and the topic is still very dangerous. It's hard to talk about walking and cycling to the government, so we've had to develop our own methods, and the situation is a lot of government officials, they have cars and they develop policies and designs around cars because they drive their cars. And oftentimes the pedestrians are forgotten. So what we've ended up having to do in Cambodia is gently introduce non-motorized transport and good street design concepts disguised in traffic flow improvement projects. So this is in Colombia. We are working on something very similar at an intersection in Cambodia, where we will really improve the traffic flow, the parking situation, but in doing so, we will reclaim lots of public space. And that's an interesting approach to introduce some of these concepts in a rather gentle way. And this is done with paint and plants. So if it's not popular, it's easy to remove. If it is popular, then you can make it a permanent installation. And that's called tactical urbanism. If we have time, we can get back to that. But before we go any deeper, I'd like to take us on a little walk, a walk some of you might have done as well, to Shaw MRT station. I think we can play the video. This is me, Saturday, around 3 p.m., so not peak hour. And I leave the hotel. And here you can see, I like this. This is good. You have an accessible at-grade ramp here as well. So if you're a wheelchair user, you can cross the street. It sort of leads into the bike lane, which is not ideal. And here we have a bike lane. I did see it used. They are used quite widely in Pasig, which is good. And they're not very protected, but they're somewhat protected. And here I am crossing the street. This is a refuge island in the middle of the street. This is good. It helps me cross in 2 stages. And it means I can cross safely one side, check the other side, then cross. Here we continue. Again, an accessible ramp, but there is a curb, so I don't know if a wheelchair can get up that. Me, it's fine. I am young, I am fairly agile. This is easy to navigate, but maybe not for everybody. Here we have a nice pedestrian right-of-way. This is quite comfortable. We pass by a driveway, and sometimes the standards fall a little short once you reach driveways. So here again, if you're in a wheelchair, you're not going to be able to overcome that, which is a shame. This is Podium Mall. It really seems like the malls do a good job when it comes to street design. They, I presume, work with architects who follow certain designs, but we have a nice smooth footpath. And here we have another crossing. Is this crossing good? Is it bad? It's a shame he has to cross and have a vehicle pass by in front of him. So maybe some kind of tabletop crossing would be good here that slows down the vehicles. And also the median, the refuge island there in the middle is not accessible to everyone. So we continue past the podium. Again, this is really good. They also have the accessible ramp. They have some bollards there to stop cars from being able to enter this space. And yeah, the malls here, I realize, are a big part of the public space available to the people of Pasig and Manila, which I find quite interesting. I saw a lady yesterday walking her dog through the mall, which I have never seen anywhere else in the world. This is a big intersection. I didn't continue this way. I just wanted to check it out. Here we have a crossing. No refuge island, not ideal for the ladies crossing here. And over here, I found this quite interesting. It looks like they created an accessible area there. A wheelchair is roughly 1.2 meters, so I'm not sure if that's wide enough. But now we go back. The ladies wanted a picture, so I took a picture of the ladies. And on we go. So we continue along the footpath. Again, this is quite okay. But granted, Pasig is probably one of the best street designed areas in a lot of Manila, but you can really see a variance in quality. Around the malls, it's really good. Away from the malls, it's not so good. Here, this is quite interesting. We have a big piece of pedestrian infrastructure. This is a pedestrian overpass. I see there's many in Baguio as well. I don't like them. You have to climb all these stairs, and basically you're separated from the vehicles. As a pedestrian, you're made to feel like you're lesser than a vehicle because you have to do all the extra work. And they don't work because people still walk across the street. You can build this big, expensive piece of infrastructure, but I am sure an equal amount, if not more people, choose to just cross dangerously at the street, and that becomes very dangerous because the vehicles don't expect you. They expect you to use the overpass. And then in some instances, you introduce escalators, but escalators and tropical countries don't go well together. I've seen this time and time again where the thought was there to put an escalator, but the escalators rarely work. And here we go, we cross. I do think there is an arrangement where we could improve the street level environment and integrate pedestrians instead of separating them. But of course, this is to do with traffic management, and we would need to have a broader sustainable urban mobility strategy to reduce the overall number of vehicles on the street. And here we continue. Things get a little hairy there. You're brushing shoulders with cars. Back next to a mall, nice green infrastructure. I like this space. I really feel separated from the street. There's nice hedges, some public art spaces. Here we have some kids skateboarding, which is also a form of non-motorized transport. And they can do that because it's smooth enough. They also wanted a picture. This is their picture. And we're getting there. We're almost at the MRT station. We keep going. Here, we have a tabletop crossing. I like tabletop crossings, but it leads into a wall. So people are using it diagonally, and it slows traffic, but it doesn't really serve its purpose. So there is room for improvement here. And we pass, this is, I think, is it the Mega Mall? The Global Mall? Mega Mall? Onwards we go. Cyclists, this is good. It's great. Someone's using the cycle lane. He is using it against the flow of traffic, which is maybe not safe. And there was a motorbike encroaching the lane. So build it and they will come, but they won't always use it how it's intended. I really like this space. Here we have a very long pedestrian crossing. Maybe there's a way we could create 2 stages there. A refuge island, yes. And this is Shaw Boulevard. I'm told this is the stairway to heaven. But there is an elevator in the back here. And this is where I wanted to end my trip, but I wanted to see more cycle lanes. So I kept going a little further. Here's some really good cycling infrastructure, but it's obstructed by motorcycles. And as we cross, you can see the crossing could be a little wider. This is not peak hour, and it's already very congested, lots of pedestrians, so maybe a bit more space could have been allocated for the pedestrian crossing. But again, accessible ramps. And here we're on the other side. We've got some nice, well, unprotected bike lanes, but I did see a lot of cyclists. So I don't know if they were there before the bike lanes, but it does seem like the bike lanes are used, sometimes in the wrong direction. And the situation is unfortunate because you see a lot of obstructions. So here, jeepneys are blocking the bike lane, so he has to dangerously cycle out. Same is happening here, and you can see he has 2 kids on his bike, which is quite impressive, but he has to veer around the jeepneys, which is quite dangerous. And then they also wanted a picture, and that's the end of my walk. If we go to the scoring criteria, and we can put up our hands, this is purely by feel. How safe was my walk? Out of 5? 3? Yeah, I didn't feel like I was in great danger. There was a few moments when I was passing the entrances of the malls, so I think 3 is fair. Comfort? 3? Okay. You haven't been to Cambodia. We're really on the street in the city center, and this is quite enjoyable. It's all relative, I suppose. Surfacing. So you got 3, 3, 6. The surfacing. We had a mix. The malls all had nice paving. In between, not so nice. So a mix, maybe 3. Shade. 4? 2? 2 or 4? 2? Okay. The crossings. There was quite a lot of crossings. I don't like the overpasses. So in my opinion, that would bring down the score. But there was a lot of quite good crossings. They were painted. They were very well identifiable. Inclusivity. So say you're in a wheelchair. Again, it's hit or miss, like 2.5. Yeah, I don't know what our total score was. I did it myself. I gave it about 26 out of 50. So just above 50%. And I could add and take. But that's my user experience. I think we can all agree that there is a lot of good practice and a lot of room for improvement. And we will look at what this is in this presentation, how this could have been improved. So back to the fundamentals. Some of this will seem very obvious, but what is a street? Does anyone have an abstract explanation of what a street is? I hear little chatters of answers. I mean, I have a bit of a poetic answer. Well, not so much, but it's a unit of space through which people experience a city. It's where we experience a city. It's where we live. Chances are you are in a building or you're in a street if you live in an urban setting, and a lot of our life is experienced on the street. And streets are spaces for people. So here you can see people. Some are shopping, some are hanging out, some are socializing, and it's also a corridor for movement. And our streets should be designed for all these different experiences. And we should also think about the broader social, economic, and environmental goals of our city. And that all happens in and around streets. So we need to design good streets. And streets, although in many places we don't design around people, they are not just spaces for vehicles. Streets are for vehicles and people. Highways are for vehicles. But if you plan your city extremely well, you will really not need that many urban highways. So our streets should really be nice and mixed. And here's another more poetic explanation of what a street is, but streets are the stage upon which the drama of life unfolds every day. So basically, it's where we live. It's where life happens. But recently, they have been reduced to a more restricted role, serving as conduits for the movement of automobiles. And I see that to be the case in many cities in the Philippines. I may sound very critical. I am from the little country of Ireland. We have terrible non-motorized transport. So I'm not looking down or up. I'm saying it in the context of what best practice should be. My country has so much work to do when it comes to non-motorized transport. So just making that clear. Streets are also multifunctional spaces. So this is in Baguio. This is great. I'm not too sure what's going on here, but night market. I really like what I see. You have the space for the conduit of vehicles. It's nicely separated from the night market, and people are moving up and down. Some are stopping and accessing some of the market spaces. And then you have a nice clear right-of-way on either end. So this is really quite nice. I'm sure this is a busy street, and it's well configured. Also, the parallel parking I quite like. I've seen a lot of streets here with perpendicular parking, where vehicles will park in perpendicularly and then have to reverse out, which impedes the flow. So this is a much better setup. So Baguio, great job. And all our streets should be designed a little more like that. Obviously, it depends on the type of street, but a wide commercial street like that should cater for pedestrians, for cyclists, for the transit riders, for motorists, freight operators, businesses. So a lot of different functions are happening on streets, and we should cater for them. And this is done extremely well in Baguio here. Streets are also dynamic spaces. They change over time. This is Rizal Avenue in Manila. You used to have an at-grade on the ground level, a sort of tram system, and today that's been elevated. But basically the point is, streets change. They often change around the dominant mode of transport, and more it's become vehicles in the context of Manila and probably your cities too. And they also change not over long periods of time, but very short periods of time. COVID, you saw a lot of your cities just become void of traffic, which is quite a fascinating phenomenon, and that created an opportunity to introduce lots of new cycling infrastructure. It's just to illustrate how streets are very dynamic spaces, and you can really transform your city by transforming your streets. And we should be transforming our streets to more complete streets. This is the configuration we see in many of our cities. It's what many intersections look like. It's quite chaotic. And if we were to create a complete street, there's lots of different definitions we can use. We heard living streets yesterday in some of the presentations, which are great. This is a complete street, which is an approach where we try to better balance the needs of non-motorized transport with motorized transport. And this is a street that caters for all ages and abilities. And this configuration can and should enable safe, smooth, and seamless travel for all ages and all abilities. And I think Sovan mentioned yesterday in the beginning how he did exercises where he was blindfolded. I did similar when I was in university. They'd put us in a wheelchair and we had to experience parts of our city and transit systems. And you really realize how we completely overlook a small percentage of the population. But if you design your city for someone in a wheelchair, every single person benefits, including them. So complete streets is really the policy and design approach we should follow, because it helps us in the context of road traffic accidents, noise and air pollution, energy consumption, inequity, public space, and public transport ridership. So this is the usual stuff you will hear. And so over to the Philippines, and you know this all better than I do. Philippines is growing extremely fast. The GDP has seen steady growth. The population is growing. The land use is growing because of the economic and population growth. We saw this graphic yesterday of how Manila is expanding horizontally, but also vertically. But the horizontal expansion is probably encouraging a rapid motorization rate, and the vehicle ownership rate is on the rise. I didn't realize how low it is. 6% nationally own a private vehicle, 7 to 8% in Manila. You would really, it feels like there's a much higher car ownership rate, which is a bit scary, because if another 2, 3, 4% get a private car, I have no idea how things will move, how anyone will get to to ADB or anywhere in Manila and maybe your cities as well. And of course, with this, we get congestion, air noise pollution, road traffic accidents, and as the country has modernized and motorized, the public realm has really suffered, and it's received less attention and investment, and now we have inadequate walking infrastructure, dangerous crossings, poor illumination, and a lack of street furniture, which is the story in many places in the world. Which is unfortunate because our cities are our homes. It's where we live. We should try to make them attractive and enjoyable. And yeah, in many areas, the urban environment has been designed as if people on foot do not exist. I find this example quite funny. This is the Ortega MRT station, very close to here. And they built the dedicated bus lane carousel system without giving much thought to how pedestrians will access the buses. And they have this very narrow lane that has to be managed by an attendant. You might know this better than I do. But if you can't access public transport comfortably and in a dignified way, chances are, or there's a lower inclination that you will use it. So we really need to reprioritize pedestrians in how we design our cities. And we need to find a better balance between motorized and non-motorized transport users. Essentially, all of our jobs here entail absorbing growth. You all work and live in a context of growth, and when you boil it down, what we need to do is find the best way to absorb this growth, and it has to be done in a sustainable way that works in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and a very good way to do that is by developing a multi-dimensional strategy that has high capacity transit, like we saw yesterday with the TOD module, plus non-motorized transport, and they go very well together. And when you really focus on these, you will reduce the car ownership, and you can encourage more sustainable growth, equal opportunity, and a higher quality of life. Just when you need to communicate to your car drivers why you are removing space from vehicles, numerically, it makes sense. So here you have a 3-lane road, and this can move 3,000 passengers per hour per direction. That's your PPHPD, with 3 lanes on either side. The common approach, once that reaches a point of saturation, is let's elevate these vehicles and increase the number of lanes. So we elevated the road, we have some kind of overpass or sometimes underpass, and now we can move 4,700 more vehicles. We've increased the capacity using the vertical space, and we've improved the traffic flow, at least temporarily. But if we look at a more multimodal approach, so say we introduce a high capacity bus rapid transit system, we go from moving 4,700 people per hour per direction to 12,000 up to 38,000. So this is a huge difference. And for policymakers, we really need to think about how to move the greatest absolute number of people and not vehicles. And a lot of good practice exists. I haven't had time to really study the carousel here, but in Jakarta, I took this picture a few weeks back. All of these cars, assuming there's 2 people in each car, which is a high occupancy rate, normally it's around 1.6, all of these cars equals 78 passengers, taking up this huge spatial area, while one bus here has 85 passengers. And you could have back-to-back buses and move significantly more people by focusing on moving people and not vehicles. And this has really helped the city of Jakarta keep their economy moving. 10% of the population use the Trans-Jakarta BRT every day. And I'm glad to hear a lot of projects are happening in the Philippines. So I wish you the very best of luck, because this is really the key to enable a lot of the other sustainable urban mobility concepts we will be discussing. Anyway, I am very aware that a lot of great work is happening in the Philippines. A lot of thought is going into this, and a lot of these concepts have probably already been presented to you. We are also following the low carbon transport project. We also have Elijah here. Thank you for joining us, who helped lay some of the foundational steps of some of these sustainable urban mobility concepts. And we hope we can help carry those forward together in a collaborative fashion. But a lot of very good work is happening. It's just quite patchy. I spent many hours on Street View, moving around your respective cities, trying to get an understanding. But I've seen a lot of good practice. Baguio, you have an at-grade median, which is accessible for all, and I see tactile strips for someone, say, with a visual impairment, they can cross. General Santos, I see some kind of accessible crossing here. It's quite resource intensive, but it serves its purpose. Bacolod, I see you have a cycle lane here, and because it's not tarmacked, it is visually separated, which is good. It could be protected, of course. And in Iloilo, I have many other examples. I'm not sure how this image made it here, but that's a very wide crossing. Maybe not an example of best practice, but you have a crossing, and it's signalized. But maybe a refuge island in the middle there would be welcomed. The same applies for cycling. All of you have introduced cycle lanes. I see them manifest in lots of different ways. Is there a national standard? Yeah. Separated at grade. Okay. Okay, 1.5 meters. Yeah, so I've seen a lot of nice examples. The topic of protected, unprotected bike lanes is one we could probably open up. There's sort of an interesting discourse happening between cyclists and car drivers, and it'd be nice if we could, amongst ourselves, even discuss that and find ways we could rectify that. And Iloilo, I think this is your showpiece, which is great. Wide. I'm not sure how easy it is to access the lane from areas that aren't part of the bike lane, but this looks like a nice piece of infrastructure. And from what I gather, a lot of the infrastructure that's been built is really along the highways, same in General Santos. So you've created cycling access to the CBDs, which is a great way to start. But from what I've seen, there's many ways we can create a much denser network of cycle lanes in your cities. And I spent the weekend here, and I went out in Makati on Saturday night, and I was thinking a lot about this presentation. So I cornered some unfortunate new friends and asked them what their thoughts were on non-motorized transport. And someone recommended I speak to someone who does have an opinion, just a civilian, and I wanted to get his take on bike lanes. And his opinion was protected bike lanes are few and far between. I tend to agree. I haven't seen that many protected bike lanes. I don't know what the ratio is in Manila, but maybe 10% protected, 90% not protected. And the bike lanes have become very unpopular because people think they impede car traffic and they should be removed accordingly, which is a bit selfish on behalf of car drivers because cars are very space hungry when they're parked and when they're in motion, whereas a little bicycle really doesn't take up much space. And the widths of these lanes, they vary a lot. So you have the 1.5 meter standard. That's the total width mandated, or the minimum width. But then the effective width, the usable width of the bike lane is often significantly less because you have gutters or you have a space between the curb and the tarmac that isn't very usable. So the minimum measurement, 1.5 meters, should be effective width, not total width. So you need 1.5 usable meters. His thought was that there's an impression that biking is not a legitimate form of transport. It's more a form of recreation, which is a shame. There are cities around the world that have shown us that biking is a very viable mode of transport, and it can move very large numbers of people. And if you can integrate it nicely with public transport, it can really transform your city for the better. And the other frustration you get often from the cycling activists is there's way more bike-owning households than car-owning households. But the car drivers have a lot more voice in how our cities are planned and designed. And it's a shame. And when you look at the numbers again, 6% of Filipinos drive a car. It's really a tiny minority, but the infrastructure is very much built around their needs. So there could be ways to rebalance, and we hope we can help you with that. Here's an example in Pasig. Again, lots of nice infrastructure, but then also how it is used is not always ideal or favorable for the cyclists, so he has to veer around the jeepneys. So that's sort of the context we are working with, and there are many practices we can use to improve safety. So even if you have no desire to improve the walking environment or cycling environment, the safety dimension is one that is extremely important. And safety is an issue. I saw in 2021, 11,000 were killed in traffic accidents, which is 11,000 too many. And that's an outcome of poor driving behavior. But our street design can greatly influence our driving behavior. And so we should better design our streets. And a good start is just better managing speed. So you may have seen some of these already. I will go through them quite quickly. But there's a strong relationship between speed and safety. The faster you drive, the more your peripheral sight becomes blurred. And so say you're driving at 50 kilometers an hour and you're on your motorbike and something as simple as a street dog runs out, you can't see him and you can't react in time. And then you can have a really bad accident at any moment. And so lowering speed it definitely is a good thing. And it also reduces the risk of fatality if there is an accident. So above 70 kilometers an hour, it's pretty much guaranteed there will be a fatality. But then if you lower that speed to 30 kilometers an hour, the risk is significantly reduced. And that's because of stopping distance. And I know the topic and the idea of lowering vehicle speeds may not be popular to car drivers, but if we slow down the overall average speed, we can sometimes, and in many instances, reduce the overall journey time. It's counterintuitive that lowering speeds helps you get to your destination faster, but if you lower speeds and you reduce congestion, then your trip becomes shorter. There's a whole theory around that. It's called gemology. I can recommend searching that, but lowering speeds can be beneficial for everybody, including the car drivers. And there's many ways we can do that using street design. So traffic calming is a way of designing our streets to slow down the traffic. Lots of interesting design ideas for that. You can narrow your lanes. You can reduce your corner radii. So a lot of turning movements, and I think one of our examples here in the interactive exercise has very wide turning movements, which means vehicles can drive really quite fast around the corner, which is quite dangerous. So if we can tighten our corner radii down to 1.5 meters is really best practice. It really forces cars to slow down, but anywhere from 3 to 5 meters is good. And if you tighten your corner radii, you also reduce the pedestrian crossing distance. So you slow down vehicles, you reduce the crossing distance, everybody wins. And here's an example. This was in Ethiopia, the city I was working in. Very wide radius, singular, yeah. And so this guy is very exposed by traffic that might be moving quite fast. Using paint and plants, we tighten this up, and now vehicles have to slow down much more. And we've also made this crossing distance significantly shorter. Another few design ideas, and there's dozens of these. You can check the guidelines for more ideas, but you could create a pinch point if you want to slow down traffic. That mightn't be very popular, but it's also beneficial for pedestrians. You could introduce a mini roundabout at an intersection if vehicles are taking dangerous turning movements. So you force them around the roundabout. That can organize traffic and slow speeds. Trees have lots of benefits, but they also induce a sort of calming effect. If you drive down a street with lots of trees, this is an example in Hanoi, you have a tendency to slow down, and it also alters your perception, narrows your field of view, so you have an inclination to drive slowly. So one of dozens of reasons to include green infrastructure in our streets. Another example is chicanes, lane shifts. So here they have an example in Singapore where they create S-shaped paths, so you're forced to slow down. And I imagine it's also still quite fun to drive along. You feel like you're a race car driver almost. Speed humps, I'm sure you have many speed humps. Another option is, yes, the raised crossings, and I've seen some good examples. So those are really fantastic. This is a nice example again from Singapore. You have all the good features, a little refuge island there that is level, and you've got your raised crossing. Everything is well pointed out using paint. And so that's safety. Now over to our footpaths, because NMT is really creating high quality infrastructure around all of these different elements. So safety is one. Then you have to have good footpaths. Footpaths are how we move through space, but also access buildings. And there's many different types of footpaths. For the sake of this exercise, we'll look at commercial footpaths. They would generally take priority when you're looking at ways to improve your city environment. The way a footpath can be broken down is into different zones. You have the frontage zone, so that's the area in front of the shops, the buildings. Then you have the pedestrian zone, and the pedestrian zone should be unobstructed. This is the pedestrian right-of-way. That should be generally a very minimum of 1.8 meters, so two people can comfortably pass each other, but also a wheelchair can comfortably move through that space and rotate around itself. We have also a furniture zone, benches, lights, green infrastructure, utilities, and if there's space left over, and this is part of our cycling network, you can have your cycle lanes. Ideally, your cycle lanes aren't on the street next to traffic. You could have, say, your parking in between or a strip of green infrastructure to make it safer. And there's also different elements. You should want to have an active frontage. You don't want to have just a blank wall on your street. Ideally, you have lively shops, you have lights, you have seating areas, and you have green infrastructure, which I previously alluded to. And when it all comes together, you can create a nice network of footpaths, which also take into account driveways. So the footpath should be continuous across the driveways, which we didn't see around the mall here. And you can separate or block vehicles from entering the pedestrian space using bollards. You also have to give thought to your bus stops, and I've seen different examples of that being done quite well. You can have designated parking areas. Here we can see it sort of bulbs out, reduces the crossing distance. We have a tabletop crossing. So all of these different ideas can come together to make nice footpaths. The surfacing of our footpaths is also important. This is the material they were using in this Ethiopian city I was working in. So very thin tiles, which made them cheaper, but because they were cheaper, they were also more fragile. And over time, they would crack, they would break, and it wasn't a good long-term investment because they needed replacing. Then they shifted to these kinds of thicker blocks, smaller and thicker, but they didn't lock well together, so they were coming undone. And a better option is to have thicker blocks that are interlocking, so they will not move and they're less likely to also shift, so you can create a more smooth and seamless footpath. So lots of little details like that you can take into account. And once you have good footpaths, you obviously need to be able to go from footpath to footpath. For that, you need good crossings. And for good crossings, you need to have some infrastructure wherever there's a concentrated need. So at intersections, people will want to cross, so you should have crossing infrastructure. But then sometimes at mid-blocks, people will also want to cross, and you should cater for that. So where there's a shopping mall entrance, but not an intersection, you probably should have a crossing. Same with bus stops, and generally every 80 to 100 meters, you should have a crossing. And this is Lacson Avenue in Manila. And I imagine if you live here and your neighbor lives here, you very rarely see each other because you may have to take your motorbike and drive for 2 kilometers just to see your neighbor, because there's no pedestrian crossing infrastructure, which is a shame. It really starts to dissect our city and dissect our communities. And a good crossing looks something like this. We saw this already. You should also have it well illuminated because streets are most dangerous at night. And so illumination, I mean, it's evident, should be provided at crossings so people can cross more safely. The crossings should be at grade. Generally, unless absolutely necessary, overpasses should be avoided. An overpass is maybe a good thing to have if you're crossing a river, but not necessarily a street, because they increase the crossing distance for people. They decrease the footpath area, and they're super expensive. So a better strategy is just to have a broader sustainable urban mobility strategy that focuses on reducing vehicles and not one where we just build around vehicles, which doesn't work because guaranteed people are crossing over the median because this is just inconvenient. Crossings, again, here, there's a nice example in Makati, should be at grade unless you have a tabletop, and should be aligned with the pedestrian right-of-way. So you have a continuous line to walk across. If you don't, chances are you will just cross following the pedestrian right-of-way, and the crossing might not be aligned with that. That's sort of known as pedestrian desire lines, and there's another example in one of the interactive exercises we can look at. Diagonal crossings, if you have a lot of pedestrian movements, these are quite cool. In Kuala Lumpur, we have Bukit Bintan. It's inspired by the Shibuya crossing in Tokyo, but Shibuya crossing moves 500,000 people a day. The way it works is it's a signalized intersection, and there's a phase where no vehicles can drive and all pedestrian movements are possible. And it's really beautiful. You see all the people pour in, and if there's a very high demand for pedestrian movement, this is a nice option. Staggered crossings, another option. If you force pedestrians to, or if you have a good refuge island, you can make the crossing 2 stages, which is a lot safer. And also in this configuration, you have to cross, then turn, face traffic. You see the oncoming traffic, it's much safer, and then you can continue. So that's a really nice option. Refuge islands, very important, and there's a lot of good practice already happening in the Philippines, which is great to see. The refuge islands, there's different ways to make them comfortable and protected. One is with median tips, which means vehicles will really not get too close to you. They should also be wide enough, 1.8 meters minimum, or probably the minimum should be the width of the average bicycle, so that a bicycle user or someone with a pram can safely take refuge. So that's footpaths and crossings, and it's great if you introduce these, but you have to really create a complete network of good footpaths and crossings if you really want to encourage non-motorized transport. And that's in part determined by the block sizes. Some of your cities have finer blocks. Not too sure about Manila. Around here, quite big. Wherever Daniel Burnham was, so in Baguio, I think you also have, in the older areas, maybe smaller block sizes? Small? Okay. So small is good because you can make more interesting trips where you can move between the blocks as opposed to very big blocks where you'd be more inclined to not walk and use a different mode of transport. This is in Cambodia. The city center is built off an original French urban plan, and so we have nice blocks, which makes it very convenient for walking if there was good non-motorized transport infrastructure. So it's really easy to navigate the streets. And of course, you can't just recreate your street grid, but there are ways, especially as many of you develop new infrastructures in your city. Every time a new mall is built is also an opportunity to create an arcade or a passageway through the mall to make the block size smaller. And it's also a good way for shops to get more footfall and more potential customers if they also become part of the street network. So this is an example in Japan. This is in Singapore. I couldn't believe it when I saw this. You have a cycle lane that goes through a mall that can only be used from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. And then basically it makes the block size smaller and makes the urban environment more permeable. And this is how you could configure your urban area. I know space is not in abundance in some of your cities. Baguio, I've heard that many times, that you just don't have much space. But there are interesting ways you can reclaim some space and create nice networks. So here we have our street network. Some streets are pedestrian-only streets. Some have plazas. Some are shared streets. And there's also some parklets. I'll show some examples of what these are, where instead of having parking, you take 2 parking spaces and you make a little public space. And you can also have slow zones. So obviously, if you want to promote non-motorized transport, you have to manage traffic and find a good balance between both. And there's some nice examples over in Jakarta. There's Kota Tua. It's the old historical center. And they've done really good work to create a low emission zone. And I think similar ideas could apply in your cities, especially in the historical areas. In Manila, you have Intramuros. That's an area where there could be a lot of improvement. It could be made into a low emission zone and eventually a no emission zone. Here they redirected traffic, they introduced new cycle lanes, they blocked off certain streets, and they pedestrianized one big avenue. And it's a really nice project. And that's also a way you can start thinking about non-motorized transport. Pick a specific area, and I know that's being done. Baguio, you have plans for the inner city area, and maybe you can draw inspiration from the likes of Kota Tua in Jakarta. Then accessibility is extremely important. We have the need to provide for, say, wheelchairs, but anyone, even someone with a suitcase or a small cart, they would benefit from ramps, and there's design or standards around the ramps. I think you already use them. Generally, it's no more than a 10% gradient. Tactile strips, I've seen some of your newer footpaths developed with these, but it doesn't seem like the malls are using them, for example. So I don't know if they're included in the national standards, but basically these strips that tell you when you can go, when you can stop, where public transport is. It's obviously very valuable and necessary for visually impaired street users. Some of you are considering BRT projects. A BRT project is so much more than just a public transport project. It's really a catalyst to revamp an entire urban corridor. And you can give thought to how the BRT can link to non-motorized transport, to good footpaths, to cycle lanes. And you have to give a lot of thought on how you can make it accessible to all. So this is the Transjakarta. You have ramps to access the stations. Obviously, the buses have level boarding. And when you are planning your BRTs, really see them as an opportunity, as a catalyst to improve the infrastructure surrounding the corridor, but generally just around the station precincts. So, 500 meters away from the station is where people will be walking from to get to the public transport. So these can be nice opportunity projects. And then lastly, public space. Now that we can move around and we can feel safe, we probably also want to enjoy ourselves in our spaces. And for that, we can't just it's not a fair proposition to say, hey, build new parks, because that's very disruptive. But there are ways you can reclaim some spaces. So you can create public plazas that could involve removing parking or reorganizing parking. This is in New York. This was not very optimized. They removed some parking and maybe offset it to a surrounding street, but they created a nice little public plaza, which is small but quite effective. If you live around here, you've got yourself a nice little coffee spot. The parklet concept, again, when you introduce a new parking strategy, you can, keep a few spots just to create nice little outdoor spaces. And I don't go into depth into the topic of street vendors, but there's a lot of street vendors in the Philippines. There are ways you could create designated spaces for them, and it can serve as a way to start formalizing your public spaces. This is a very iconic example. This is the New York High Line. It just tells a really nice story. This in the 90s, they were going to remove this old railway track because it was not being used anymore, and some architects came together, put together a design for an urban walkway. I think it's 2.4 kilometers long in East Manhattan. And you might think, well, this sounds extremely expensive, but again, similar to with TOD, you build an infrastructure like this, it's very attractive. Land values around it will go up. Higher land values, depending on your tax system, you can recoup some of that and cross-subsidize infrastructures like this. So if you make your city more attractive, you also affect your land values, and you can use that to cross-subsidize projects. There's also really nice examples in Seoul. This is Cheonggyecheon, where they had a small stream. They built a massive urban highway over it. But then over the period of 20, 30 years, Seoul started developing sustainable urban mobility projects. They created a vast public transport network, and they got to a stage where they really reduced the number of vehicles, and they turned this stream back into a public space with somewhat of a river, and it's a very beautiful space. This is also an old flyover, which they converted into, again, an urban park. And these projects might seem and feel impossible, but if you can create interconnected public transport systems, then these ideas become more viable. Then just a nice topic is that of tactical urbanism that we spoke about earlier. If you don't know where to start, you can start very simply using cones, and just cones and paint can go a long way. So we're happy to support you explore some ideas which are not disruptive, and if they are disruptive, very easy to remove. And lots of nice examples. So we're doing this in Phnom Penh. We could do similar in one of your cities. And it's not just an exercise of paint. We did a lot of data collection. We're going to do some simulation of the space, and we're going to make sure that anything we propose will improve the flow of vehicles, and that will make sure that our project is popular. And then there's a lot of other considerations. I don't have time to go into them, but in the future, if we can establish a good working relationship, and this is a topic you're interested in developing further, we could be delivering trainings or developing activities around parking, wayfinding, all the signaging that goes into your streets to help people navigate, illumination, green infrastructure, utilities is a very important one. You can build very beautiful sidewalks, and then a different government department who takes care of utilities can come and dig it all up. So you want to find ways to better phase your non-motorized transport and street design projects with other utility projects. Or if you go all out in Barcelona, they've created basically a tunnel network under the footpaths where you can access all the different utilities without having to dig up the street, which is nice, but obviously quite expensive. Vendors, very important and very relevant. Freight and transit. So lots of different topics we could have covered, we should have covered, but we don't have the time for today. On the topic of street vendors, there's often a desire to eradicate street vendors, which is not realistic. People are not street vendors because they want to be, it's because it's their livelihood. And so we can explore ways to better integrate them. If there's a policy not to fully formalize them, you can still just create designated spaces where these alternative street activities can happen. So in Chennai, India, it's not here anymore, but initially they just painted lines where street vendors could sell and where they couldn't sell. And there's policemen who enforce it, and it maintains a good pedestrian right-of-way. And in the longer term, Singapore, what they did was really interesting. They didn't eradicate street vendors. They formalized them and gave them larger designated spaces called hawker centers. This is a very famous one where they've kept some of the street life. Obviously, it's transformed. It doesn't look exactly the same as it was before. It's not on the street side, but they've kept that culture alive. And as your cities modernize, I hope you can keep that fun street life that makes the cities so interesting. I hope you can keep that, and not look to eradicate it. I think we'll leave it at that. So thanks very much. SMMR is an ASEAN-German cooperation project implemented by GFA Consulting Group and partners on behalf of GIZ. For more information on the SMMR project, do consider checking out www.summer.asia. We look forward to seeing you there.